get my 6. And happy Halloween, everybody. It's officially here, October 31. Though with this beautiful, nearly 80-degree temperature day here in Central Virginia, it doesn't feel like the last day of October. But we'll take it. I actually got sunburned a bit this morning on my run. It's feels like summer. So I was getting ready to go for my run this morning, and my son, just from out of the blue, he says, "Dad," he says, "do you think God really wants us to worship him?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And he says, "What do you think?" I said, "I think he wants us to be grateful." And he says, "For what?" And I said, "For everything, for all of it." I said, "For you, your mom, our health, our home." He says, "You know what, Dad?" He says, "I think being grateful is a form of worship." And then he walked in the other room, and I went out of the house, and about 2 or 3 miles into my run, it just hit me that I'd never heard that before. 10-year-old kid, what do they say? Out of the mouths of babes. I'm grateful for everyone who is here today to hear the story, and people who read my books and watch the channel, but I'm grateful for all of it. I'm very grateful to have known a man and to have been friends with a man who I consider to be the greatest oral storyteller I've ever known. Probably more than anybody, more than, my favorite writers, Stephen King, Michael Crichton, Mark Twain, more than anyone. He's the reason I'm a storyteller today. His name was PJ. He's been gone for a few years now, but he will never be forgotten. And it's my hope that stories like this, Halloween night at PJ's cabin, can allow this man's memory to live forever, because he was worthy. Halloween night at PJ's cabin. We were in our local department store, Benny, one of my childhood best friends, and me, and we were browsing through all of the Halloween decorations and costumes. Only 2 weeks away from that great night of Halloween, it was, and though we were 15 years old and a couple of years done with trick-or-treating, we still found ourselves unable to pull away from the gruesome, hideous masks, costumes, figurines, and assorted decorations of the season. We both felt we should have outgrown becoming excited over Halloween. However, in time, I would learn that if one is a true fan of all things Halloween, the feeling of excitement each year that comes with the season never goes away, no matter how old one becomes. "You guys going trick-or-treating this year?" A sweet-sounding voice came from behind us, followed by the laughter of 2 girls. Benny and I turned around and saw Jody and Lisa, 2 of the prettiest girls in our school. Why, if we hadn't known any better, Benny and I would have believed they were teasing us. "Of course not," I said. We're too old for such nonsense. We're just curious to see what costumes are out this year." This, a curiosity I find pulling me down the Halloween aisle of any store I enter during the fall of the year all these years later. Nearly 40 of them. "Sure you're not," Jody said, deviously. "I bet you guys are going to go trick-or-treating." Both girls laughed again, and this time there was no doubt about it. They were teasing us. "No, they ain't," a man's voice came from behind Benny and me. We followed the girls' eyes, which had fallen upon the face of the man behind us, and we turned, and there, standing only 2 feet away, was our old buddy PJ. A local mountain man of about 50 years old at the time, who lived way back in the woods on top of the highest hill surrounding our little mountain town in Appalachistan. Everyone knew PJ by appearance and name, and by his old beater of a 4-wheel drive pickup he drove that looked as if it were being held together with duct tape and shoestrings, because it was, but which could go places no other 4-wheel drive vehicle in our county could go. But Benny and I, as well as a few of our other friends, knew him quite well personally. For several years, he'd allowed us to use a cabin that he'd previously lived in to go camping and hunting. The cabin was even further back in the woods than the one he currently occupied. He'd built his new cabin and current residence about a mile lower on the mountain than his old cabin, in which he let us use whenever we wanted, in order to lessen the hairiness of coming off the mountain in the winter. "They're going to go camping up at the cabin on Halloween night. They done told me. Ain't that right, boys?" Yeah, I said. I was just going with it. Old PJ was bailing us out, helping us save face. Because to be truthful, just before Jody and Lisa had shown up and started teasing us, Benny and I were having a conversation about the likelihood of us being able to go trick-or-treating without being found out. if we wore the right costume and mask, just so, etc. We'd almost had a game plan, and then the girls showed up, so we were very grateful for PJ showing up when he had. Do you girls want to join him? PJ asked the young ladies. Don't you, live way back in the woods on top of the mountain? Jody asked. Sure do, PJ said, but the cabin we're talking about is even further back than that. What do you say, girls? It would be a fun night. You think you're up for it? No way, Lisa said. My dad said he's been to your cabin. He said it's really secluded and really creepy at night. I can't imagine how creepy it would be on Halloween. Okay, so I'll admit that I started actually entertaining the idea of staying in PJ's cabin on Halloween night during this brief conversation, but after having heard Lisa say what she had, I started thinking differently. Sure, I'd spent many nights at PJ's cabin over the previous couple of years, but never had I done so on Halloween night. And Lisa had a point. It was creepy up there on top of PJ's mountain, especially after dark, and I can only imagine how much more creepy it would be on Halloween night. Well, PJ said, the invitation stands as long as the boys don't mind. We don't mind, Benny and I said in unison. No way, the girls said, also in unison. And then they walked off as if we weren't even there. Hope I didn't embarrass you fellers, PJ said after the girls were gone. I could tell you was in a pickle and I was just trying to bail you out. We don't care, I said, speaking for Benny and myself. That would be fun to stay up there on Halloween, Benny said to me. Then have at it, PJ said. Would you be willing to come up and tell us some of your super creepy, scary stories if we do, I asked. No, I done told y'all fellers last time you was up there. I think I gotta stop that. Old Red Eye's been following me off that hill faster and faster each time I come up there to tell y'all fellers them stories, and I fear one of these days I ain't going to be able to beat him back to the house. At least you'll finally know what he is, Benny said. That's for sure, PJ said, but I'm afraid if and I find out, I ain't going to be around to let anyone else know what it was, what I found out. Benny and I laughed. PJ had a special, folksy way of making even the horror and terror of the supernatural and paranormal seem funny. But my offer stands, PJ said, as he started pushing his cart filled with a few provisions for life on the mountain, extra thick wool socks, long johns, and several large cans of ground coffee down the aisle. If and y'all fellers want to use the cabin on Halloween, it'll be there. Ain't going nowheres, unless it burns down between now and then. Benny and I, though both a bit apprehensive, saw it as an invitation we couldn't pass up, so we told PJ we'd probably do it, though we both knew we'd chicken out and take a rain check. Until the next day at school. Are you guys really going to do it? Benny and I heard someone asking as we sat together in the school's cafeteria at lunch. Like always, I was eating the school's hot lunch, and Benny had packed. Rather, Benny's mother had packed his lunch, and he was eating it. We looked up and saw that the person who'd spoken was Amy, yet another pretty girl in our grade. Benny quickly rushed to shove the sticky tab that was in his lunch and upon which his mother had written one of her little smitten notes for him like, Mommy misses you, or Mommy can't wait for you to get home from school, into his pants. I always teased him about those little notes, but to be honest, I was always jealous of him. Do what? I asked Amy. Jody and Lisa have been telling everyone in school that you guys are going to spend Halloween night camping in some creepy old cabin up on the mountain, Amy said, where that creepy old Vietnam vet lives. He's not a creepy Vietnam vet, Benny said sternly, almost shouting. Amy stepped back, her eyes opening wide. He's a GD hero. Wow, Amy said. Who pissed in your Cheerios? Yeah, we're going to do it, I said, my quick attempt to keep these two from entering into a full-blown argument. That's what we've been sitting here talking about. As I finished my statement, I overheard some kids sitting at the table behind us saying, wow, they're really going to do it, in hushed tones. This was when Benny and I realized we had to do it. People were speaking of us in hushed tones, the epitome of every middle schooler's fantasy. Yeah, Benny said, his chest out and his head up, and you're welcome to join us if you'd like. No way, weirdo, Amy said, and then she turned and walked away. Looks like we're local legends already, Benny said to me, smiling, pulling his mother's note out of his pocket and smoothing it out. He'd told me once that when he gets home each day, he sticks his mother's sticky tabs on the side of the refrigerator. I could only imagine how he'd explain one getting crinkled, obvious evidence that he'd try to hide her affection from his friends. Not until we actually do it, I said. Looks like we're committed, Benny said, and we were. Pages sticking together. Pardon me while I hydrate. The next 2 weeks flew by. The small town, which was beautiful back then and had a strong middle class because the internet had not yet come into being and had not yet driven the stake through the dying heart of small towns like ours across America, was being decorated for the season, both by private residences at their homes in their well-manicured lawns, as well as by the city, who always put up black and orange bows on the fence posts and light poles that lined our town's main street. This was back during the days when the shops on Main Street were not just open, but profitable, and there wasn't a shop in town that didn't go all out decorating for the season. So are you guys really going through with it? This time it was Jody, Lisa at her side as usual. We were in band, the last class of the day, and it was Friday, and it was Halloween. Benny and I played wind instruments. Jody and Lisa were majorettes. It was rare for two pretty majorettes to break ranks and venture off to the seated wind instrument players and have anything to do with them, but this was a big occasion. "We are," Benny said. He and I had answered the same question hundreds of times over the previous 2 weeks. It was as if every student in our school had asked us at least twice. "And you're still welcome to join us if you'd like." "No way, weirdo," Jody said, and then she and Lisa walked off. I've often wondered throughout the years since middle school if Lisa ever found her voice, or if today, nearly 40 years later, Jody is still doing her speaking for her. One may never know. We finished band class, which meant, of course, that we finished school for the day, and after Benny and I put our wind instruments away, we began leaving the band room, and I clearly remember all of the other students standing off to either side of us, watching in awe as we walked out. They looked on at us as if we were either two of the bravest guys any of them had ever seen, or as if we were two dead men walking. "Y'all fellers actually going through with it, are you?" PJ said when we approached his cabin. We'd walked, backpacks loaded and on our backs, the 2 miles straight up the mountain on what passed for the road. PJ was sitting on his porch whittling a stick with his pocket knife. He looked as if he was expecting company, and I suppose that company was us. Even though PJ would allow us to use his cabin, which sat another mile yet up the mountain above his home, we always checked in with him before we did. Looking back on it, I'm sure that's just another reason he always left us an open invitation. I've found that an attitude of gratitude and respect goes much further than an attitude of indifference and entitlement. True story. "Yep," I said. "And you promised you'd come up and tell us some stories." "Well," PJ said, "I don't remember promising, but I reckon I can come up in a bit. Maybe an hour or so after y'all head up and get settled and whatnot. I may have a tale or two left, but I'm telling you, I'll be needing to get back down here before dark if I'm going to be telling stories, because like I done told you, I'm getting too old to be trying to outrun old Red Eyes." "That works for us," I said. For me, the best part, always, about camping in PJ's cabin was the part where he'd join us for a few hours each time we did and tell us the most amazing stories Benny and I had ever heard. To this day, I've met no storyteller that comes close to old PJ, God rest his soul. "The woman's inside cooking something, not sure what, smells like squirrel. Y'all want me to bring you up some when I come?" "That's okay," Benny said. "Mom packed his food." "I bet she did," PJ said, and he laughed. Benny's mother had come up to meet PJ before we'd ever spent a night in his cabin. That whole checking out for stranger danger things moms the world overdue. And when she'd come, she'd brought a whole damn baked chicken dinner with her. Benny's mom loved food, and she loved Benny, and she always made sure that wherever he went, he and whomever was with him would not go hungry. And the amazing thing was, the woman was lean and fit, and never in her life was a pound overweight. She just loved her kid, and she loved food, and she loved to pair the two of them together. "You can bring up some of those homemade buttermilk biscuits she makes, though, if she makes them," I said. PJ's wife made the best buttermilk biscuits I'd ever eaten in my life. "I'll bring 'em," PJ said, and with that, Benny and I were off. 1 more mile, straight up, of hiking to go, and then we'd be at PJ's cabin, just in time for Halloween night. An hour and a half or so after Benny and I had gotten settled in at PJ's cabin, PJ, yet again, proved to be a man of his word. He joined us at his former abode, and he'd brought up a Tupperware container filled with his wife's buttermilk biscuits. Despite having just eaten the overstuffed turkey and cheddar sandwiches with lettuce and mayo that Benny's mom had sent with him, she always included food for me, Benny and I devoured the biscuits in no time as PJ caught his breath from his 1 mile walk, practically straight uphill. I clearly remember thinking at the time that I hoped I'd be able to walk up a mountain like that when I was old like him. Well, here I am as I sit and write, in this case read, old like PJ was then, and still able, thankfully, to run up mountains. Now, I done told you fellers, PJ said after having caught his breath, if I tell y'all any scary stories, I'm not so sure I can beat old Red Eyes back to the house. So you fellers are going to have to walk me down there and make sure he don't get me, and then y'all fellers are going to have to walk back up here in the dark. We don't care, I said. We don't, Benny said, looking at me, his eyes wide, obviously not happy that I'd spoken on his behalf. Well, now if you ain't up for it, PJ said. Benny immediately amended his response and agreed that he'd have no problem fulfilling PJ's request because, like myself and anyone who'd ever listened to PJ spin a yarn, he knew the story would be that damn good and absolutely worth it. Besides, at the time, neither Benny nor myself had actually ever seen this alleged old Red Eyes who PJ believed was a demon that would appear and come around to hear good stories well told. Alrighty then, PJ said, and with no further ado, he launched right into a story that would make the spine of the likes of Stephen King tingle. And not a soul ever saw that man again, PJ said at the end of his tale. Did they ever find out how many of them there were? Benny asked in regard to the terrifying, horrific, unspeakable creatures PJ had described in his story. Couldn't no one count that high, PJ said. Wow, I said, and I knew I'd be sleeping with one eye open all night. Well, boys, PJ said, a slight smile on his face. He knew he'd told us another good one. It's past dark and I ain't a-heading down off this hill alone. Y'all fellers promised to walk me down to my place to help me avoid old Red Eyes. Why, as good as that one was, I'm sure he's standing right outside the cabin here with his ear up to a hole in the wall. Benny and I believed old Red Eyes might very well be right outside our cabin, but we were going to prove that we were men of our words, well, teenagers of our words. So despite being half scared to death, we exited the perceived safety of the rickety old cabin and started heading off the hill with PJ. Since it was all downhill, it would be about a 15-minute walk, but it would take us twice that long to get back up. I figure that son of a gun is really wanting to come out and get somebody's soul tonight, PJ said once we'd been walking only a couple of minutes, it being Halloween and all. Benny and I were both walking on one side of PJ, who we always gave the honorary spot in the middle. As we walked down the hill, armed with only very weak flashlights, we scanned the woods all around us. So far, we'd seen no Red Eyes. Until... Did y'all fellers hear that? PJ had come to a sudden stop before speaking the words. Benny and I stopped immediately as well, and we shone our flashlights all over. No, we both said in response to his question. Looky over yonder, PJ said. He laid a hand on my shoulder so I'd know where he was in the dark. His other arm was stretched out. I followed it with my dim light and saw that he was pointing slightly into the woods about 20 yards down the road. Then, just beyond the point where my dim light reached, Benny, PJ, and I saw, peering from the side of a giant tulip poplar tree, two bright red glowing eyes. Holy crap, I said, though my words were barely more than a whisper. It's him, Benny said. What do we do? I reckon I ain't got no idea, PJ whispered. Just don't move until we figure it out. We stood silently for what seemed like forever, though in reality, I doubt 30 seconds passed, and then the two red eyes began making their way toward us. We could hear leaves crunching and sticks and twigs cracking as the owner of the red glowing eyes made its way toward us. We have to run, I said. I'm too old to be out running demons, PJ said. We're going to stand our ground. You mean we're going to fight this thing? Benny said. His flashlight was trained on the eyes as well. However, his light was just as weak as mine, so other than the bright, glowing red eyes, we could see no more details. Now you listen here, you old scallywag, you, PJ shouted at old Red Eyes. You get behind us, Satan. In the name of the blood of the Lamb, Jesus H. Christ, we cast you out, you old son of a rascal, you. And with that, the red eyes completely disappeared. Is he gone, I asked. Don't know, PJ said. There's only one way to find out. Come on, fellers. And with that, PJ began walking toward the location where the eyes had been. Reluctantly, Benny and I followed, allowing PJ to take the lead, but shining our lights in front of him so he could see. When we reached the large poplar tree where we'd seen the red eyes, we saw that no one or nothing was there. Until, Hey, Benny said, what's this? He bent over and picked up a plastic pair of toy glasses that had 2 little red lights on them. He clicked the small switch attached to one very small power pack in the center of the glasses, and 2 tiny red lights came on, one on each plastic lens. Boo! It was old Vance. He'd carefully and secretly made his way behind another large tree only feet away from the poplar tree while we'd advanced toward him. Seeing that he'd dropped his prop, he decided he'd at least raise one more scare out of us by jumping out and screaming boo. Isn't that beautiful? You MFer. Caught that one in time, I shouted. Not out of anger, but out of honest fear. Old Vance had scared the living crap out of me. Why, it's just old Vance, PJ said, acting like he wasn't in on it, but we'd soon find out he was. Old Vance was one of PJ's hunting buddies. Benny and I knew him. He was quite an interesting character in his own right. He was a really nice, soft-spoken man in his mid-40s. He seemed to be of average attractiveness, but women loved him. He'd fathered nearly a dozen children in our little mountain village by way of about 8 different women. He'd never been married to any of them. To my understanding, all 8 of them still adored him. They never dragged him to court to try to bleed him for child support and outrageous amounts he couldn't pay. They all told him to do what he could, and he did. He stocked shelves in our tiny local grocery store, and he gave half his money to the women, split 8 different ways, of course. And all was well. All 12 of his children loved him and seemed to get along with each other. It was the strangest damn thing, looking back on it, one could imagine. But hell, seemed to work for everybody involved. You guys are a-holes, Benny said after having regained his composure. Ah, PJ said, we just wanted to give you a good story to be able to go back and tell those pretty girlfriends of y'all's. And then he started laughing so hard we thought he was going to piss his pants. Y'all ought to walk us on down the hill, Vance said. Since you've made it this far, we ain't got no lights. You mean other than your 2 little red ones on your glasses there, Vance? I said. Ah, come on, fellers, PJ said. It was all done in fun in the spirit of Halloween. Benny and I agreed, and we began walking the 2 men off the mountain. We were already halfway down, so we figured why not. After we'd gone maybe 200 yards, Vance, who'd been walking in front of us, stopped all of a sudden. Y'all smell that? He said. At first, I thought he was messing with us again, as I'm sure Benny did, but when I inhaled through my nose, I'd been breathing somewhat heavily through my mouth because we were making good time, I realized he was not. I clearly smelled a very foul, pungent odor, and it was one like I'd never smelled before. Is that a skunk? Benny asked, obviously smelling it himself. That don't smell like no skunk I've ever smelled, PJ said. There's only one thing in my life I've ever smelled that smells like that. And when I seen it back then, I didn't think it was real. I've never believed what my eyes told me they was seeing back then, but that sure is the same dang smell that came just before I'd seen it. What was it? Vance asked, giving suggestive evidence, at least, to Benny and me, that he wasn't in on this one, whatever this one was, with PJ. Not a one among you would believe me if and I told you, PJ said. Try us, I said. But just as the words had left my mouth, we heard someone or something step out of the woods and into the road just ahead of us. Shine your light that-a-way, PJ whispered. I did as he said, and just past the point where my dim light shone, there appeared to be a spot in the road that was much darker than the darkness which surrounded it. Is that a bear? Vance whispered. That ain't no bear, PJ said, unless it's standing up on its hindquarters. I moved my flashlight up, and I was able to see what PJ was talking about. The figure wasn't wide per se, but it was tall, every bit of 8 feet tall. And when my light reached the top of the dark figure, we did indeed see eye shine. The shine was not red. They did not glow. It was pure, true eye shine, like the eyes of any nocturnal creature would give when hit with a light. But unlike the animal-like eyes of a cat or even a deer, these eyes were different. Much different from animals, yes, but similar to the eyes of humans. That's effing, Vance began, but trailed off. I believe it is, PJ said. What is it? Benny asked. I'll tell y'all fellers in the cabin, PJ said. I don't care how hard it is or how long it takes, but let's start backing up towards the cabin. And no matter what, let's not take that light off that thing, and let's not turn our backs to it. As crazy as it sounded, we all did as PJ had suggested. Slowly and physically challengingly, if that's a term, and if it's not, then hell, I just created it, we made our way back up the hill to the cabin. It must have taken us close to an hour to do this, but during that time, I never took my light off of that large, dark figure which remained the entire time just out of reach of my light. We could tell it was there, but we could see no details other than the eyeshine. The creature, if that's what it was, followed us up the hill the entire way. When we would stop, it would stop. When we'd creep a little farther, walking backwards, it would creep a little farther, walking forward. What I'll tell you is that Benny's legs and mine were sore for an entire week after doing this. Finally, we made it to the cabin and we all went inside and shut and locked the door. "Well," PJ said, "I hope y'all fellers don't mind company, 'cause it looks like me and old Vance is going to spend the night with you." "What the hell is that thing out there?" Benny asked. A long moment of silence filled the cabin as PJ searched for words. The only sound we heard was the crunching of leaves and the cracking of sticks and twigs under the feet of whatever the thing outside was. It was circling our cabin, slowly and methodically, as if it were looking for a way to come inside. "When I was just a boy about y'all fellers' ages," PJ said, "I seen something that ain't supposed to exist." He paused again, as if choosing his next words carefully. "There's just a couple of stories I never tell, 'cause, well, I guess it's safe to say that y'all fellers know a lot of my stories are just that. They stories. They ain't real." "Yeah," I said, feeling somewhat deflated, because I'd always believed every word of every story PJ had ever told us. I was old enough by then, though, to know that that had just been the kid in me wanting to think certain fascinating things were real, but knowing they probably weren't. "Well," PJ said, "this one's true, and that thing out there is real." "What is it?" Benny asked, and you could tell by the tone in his voice he was frustrated. He wanted an answer. He wanted to know what it was that had us bolted up tight in this old rickety cabin on top of this creepy old mountain in the pitch black darkness of a Halloween night. "There ain't no other way to say it, so I'm just going to come right out and say it," PJ said. "Boys, that thing out there's got us pinned in here is none other than a Bigfoot Sasquatch." You could have heard a pin drop in the room after PJ had spoken these words. No one laughed, no one scoffed, no one questioned PJ. Why? Because we all believed him. We'd started a fire in the wood stove before having left earlier to take PJ off the hill. There were still some embers burning, and we'd brought in enough firewood earlier to get us through the night. We spoke little through the night. We sat around on the furniture, an old couch and an equally old love seat, and we listened. When a log was needed on the fire, someone simply stood, grabbed a log, and put it on the fire. All night we sat in, not quite terror, but fascination, as we listened to the creature outside the cabin do its laps around the cabin, again as if trying to find a way in. A couple of times we could hear it brushing up against the cabin. To our great fortune, it never attempted to enter by way of the doors or windows, and it never banged on any walls. At some point during the night, all of us fell asleep. I woke first the next morning, chilly, as the fire had burned out at some point just before dawn. I could see the light of day coming through the windows. I nudged Benny, who'd fallen asleep beside me on the love seat. He too awakened. We allowed the old men to sleep as we walked around the small downstairs rooms of the cabin, peering out of every window and every hole in the wall to see if we could see the creature outside. But alas, it appeared as if it had vanished like the darkness itself when the sun had come up. "Was that one hell of a Halloween night or what?" PJ asked from behind us. He'd woken up as well and made his way into the kitchen, but Vance was still fast asleep, snoring madly away. The three of us who were awake went out the back door of the cabin. Once outside, in the beautiful morning sunlight of the first day of November, we looked all over the place, but still we saw no sign of the creature. Just as I was about to write the whole event off as a bunch of overactive imaginations, believing we'd indeed been stalked by a crazy black bear that liked walking on its hind legs, PJ said, "Hey, y'all fellers come have a look at this." Benny and I began making our way toward PJ. He'd walked over to a small creek that originated from a spring about 40 yards from the cabin. It had always been the water source for PJ and his family when they lived in the cabin. Once we pulled up beside PJ, who had his head down, staring at the small creek bank, we put our heads down too, to see what he was looking at. What we saw, all three of us, was clearly a partial track that had been left behind from the beast that had stalked us the night before. And what I will say is that the track we saw was not left by a bear. If it wasn't for the sheer size of the track, I would have suspected either PJ or Vance of having sneaked out of the cabin at some point in the night after Benny and I had fallen asleep and made the track themselves. That's how human it looked. However, any human who would have made this track would have had to have worn a size 30 shoe. Though the only part of the track that we could make out were the toes and the upper half of the foot, this part of the track was at least a foot long. If we'd been able to see the entire imprint of the foot, no doubt it would have been 2 feet long at least. "Oh my God," Benny said. "Oh my freaking God." "What y'all find?" Vance said, walking up behind us. He'd obviously woken up and come outside to find us when he found himself alone. When he reached us and looked down to see what we were looking at, he said, "Oh my God. Oh my freaking God." That would be the last night I would spend at PJ's cabin for more than 20 years. After growing up and leaving Appalachistan, I would return from time to time to visit PJ, and on a couple of occasions I would spend the night in the old cabin. PJ would always join me, and we'd swap stories and lies and more stories, but mostly lies. But we'd always come back to that one Halloween night when he, myself, and Benny and Vance had our experience with Bigfoot Sasquatch. "Did that really happen?" I would always ask PJ. "Was it really real?" "As real as me and you are sitting here," he'd always say. When the other kids at school asked us how our Halloween night at PJ's cabin had gone, we never told them of the real experience we'd had, and this was for 2 reasons. Number 1, we wanted to look big, bad, and tough and act like we'd never been scared. It worked, and we were viewed as legends for a while, until some other kid did something of note and our Halloween night at PJ's cabin had become old news. The second reason we never told any of the other kids about what had happened that night is because we knew they'd never believe us. It wouldn't have mattered to us, but we just felt like ridicule and naysaying would take away from our experience, and we didn't want anything to diminish our experience because, hey, not everyone gets to see a Bigfoot Sasquatch ever in their life, especially on that very special night we all know collectively as All Hallows Eve. The end. Thank you for joining me for another story. I hope you enjoyed my pick for Halloween, and I hope each and every single one of you watching has a happy Halloween. See you in November.